Welcome back to the next chapter of us making asteroids in GameMaker. So this is effectively, air quotes, chapter 2, and what we're going to do in this series of videos is create projectiles for the player, so the player can create some attacks that will then damage the asteroids. And then during this process, we'll try to add some UI elements so that we could see like what weapon we have equipped, how much energy we have left, and some cool things like that. So let's actually start by making a basic laser that we can spawn. Now, in the process of making this laser, I am going to utilize a programming concept known as inheritance, because that's going to let us utilize some very convenient programming tricks, specifically the concept of polymorphism, where we essentially can program collisions with lasers that address the parent object, and then all of the children will inherit that behavior. So it'll simplify our programming significantly down the road. So to do that, well, I guess let's create a new object here. So I'm going to create an object. Now, I haven't created a graphic for this because it's not going to have a graphic. This is going to be called obj underscore player underscore projectile. So the idea is that this is the parent of all player projectiles. And so when we start creating asteroids, the asteroid will just collide with this, and we don't have to write separate code for each type of weapon that we want to implement. It'll be a really convenient way to do this. So let's set up a few variables for this. We don't really need to change much, and it actually doesn't have a sprite. So if we go to variable definitions, let's create some instance variables. So let's start with probably the most obvious that a weapon needs to have, which is damage. And that is a real number, so it can stay at 0. We'll replace it later. Next up is an exist duration. This is going to be how many frames this projectile will exist for. Then we're going to create another one. And this is going to, well, I'll name it first. We'll call this allow underscore wrap. And we're going to switch this to a Boolean. This is whether or not the projectile is allowed to screen wrap. In all of my years of doing asteroids, I've found that people seem to be very split about this opinion of should the laser screen wrap as well as the players in asteroids. So it's an option. And then lastly, one more variable called effect underscore color. And we're going to switch this to a data type color. Now it's going to default to this transparent color. So I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to choose to make it white. So I'm going to click basic colors. If that's not there in your basic colors, you can just kind of like scroll the targeter to this bottom over here. Make sure alpha is 255 and just make sure everything is 255. Then we hit OK. And we can see that it's like a whole bunch of Fs. So that is some of our basic variables. Now let's program a quick event here. So add event, step, end step. And as usual, the end step is going to be for screen wrapping. So we're going to do screen wrapping and cleanup. So basically if it's existed for too long. So we'll first up screen wrap. So that's an if statement. So if allow wrap, then inside of here we'll just do move underscore wrap true, true, and 1. So if we've allowed screen wrapping, then that will screen wrap. And then we are going to decrease the existence timer. So we'll say exist underscore duration minus equals 1. And then if exist underscore duration is less than or equal to 0, then we are going to destroy this instance. So that basically says that this laser is going to exist for 30 frames, essentially half a second, because the default behavior is 60 frames per second. And so, again, one of the convenient things is because we're going to use inheritance, and this is all set up on the parent object, the player projectile, all of the future objects we create will inherit this. So let's do a little bit of cleanup before we actually start making these projectiles. So I'm starting to get a couple different objects here, and I might want to sort these. So inside of objects, I'm going to create a new group called player projectiles. I'm going to move this new object into there. Then I'm going to create a new group just called effects. So I'm eventually going to get a couple more effects, and I'm going to move this engine spark into there. And I'll create one more just for the player. So my objects can be a little bit more sorted here. I'm going to do the same for sprites. I'm going to create a group called effects. I'm going to move that engine spark into there and minimize that folder. I'm going to create another group called player. Put the player sprite in there, minimize that, and create one more group called player projectiles. And this is where we're going to start loading in the graphics for these. So let's start by creating our first laser. So I'm going to right click this and create a new sprite. And this is going to be called SPR underscore player underscore pulse laser. Just the name of the laser. And so the graphic for this, I'm going to click on import. We're going to go over to the projectiles folder. And I have a bunch of projectile graphics. You can create your own if you want. Just keep in mind that you probably want it facing to the right, considering how that's the default orientation. So you'd want, if you're going to download graphics off the internet or design your own, just make sure that they're facing to the right. Because that's going to make life a lot easier when we start rotating these. Now, the issue with some of these is they are kind of tiny. So I'm going to go into scaled and use Proj Pulse level 1 in the 2x version. So I'm going to double click that. And now I've got my projectile. It's very zoomed in. It's actually very small. So I'm going to center the origin, middle center. And I am going to change the collision mask to be precise. And I do that because this projectile is going to get rotated as I shoot in different directions. And I want to make sure the hitbox is going to rotate with it as well, because I've had issues in the past where if I keep it on rectangle, you might want to switch to like rectangle with rotation. That must be new. I never saw that before. But rectangle sometimes doesn't rotate properly, and the hitbox is pretty wonky. So either use rectangle with rotation or switch it to precise. And that looks good for my projectile. So I'm going to close this. If we want to import another one in here, we can do that because I do want to make at least 2 weapons. So I am going to create my second sprite. And I'm going to call this SPR underscore player underscore sonic laser. And I'm going to import the sonic pulse. And so this will be my other weapon. I'm going to also set its collision mask to precise. And then also make sure that it is middle center in terms of its centering. Yeah. So I've got my 2 graphics. Let's go and start making projectiles for these. So inside of player projectiles, I'm going to right click that folder and create a new object. And I'm going to call this object obj underscore player pulse laser. Kind of a long name. Meh. I mean, length of name isn't a huge issue. So I do want to choose that sprite. So we're going to go into the folder that has that graphic. But here's going to be one of our first differences. We do want to choose parent, and I'm going to choose the parent to be the ungraphicked object player projectile. Because then that means it's going to inherit, you can see that it's already inherited this end step. This little icon right here indicates that this was an inherited behavior that came from the parent. So it's gonna, if we change the parent, it'll just update this. And now the variable definitions, you can see that we've also inherited a lot of these from the parent as well. Now, we probably want to change some of these. So like, for example, I don't want this laser to deal 0 damage. So I am going to edit that and change it to 10. The exist duration, I do want this to be a slightly longer ranged weapon. So I'm going to set it to 15. I'll leave allow wrap to be true. And the effect color, because this is kind of a red-ish laser, I do want to choose a red color here. So maybe I'll just go pure red. Or I could pick more of an orange, but... and so these will be the properties of this laser. Now there's nothing else we really need to do with this for now. And actually the asteroid is going to handle most of the destruction of this object. Ooh, my cat wants to handle the destruction of that object. All right, so now that we've created that, we want the player to be able to spawn these lasers. So let's go over to the player. And, well, this is going to get a little bit more messy because we are going to want to implement an attack. So under our read movement keys, let's throw some other ones in here. So var, let's just call this primary attack, because we might implement like a secondary attack or like some specials or something like that. So keyboard underscore check vk underscore space. So we'll use the space bar as our primary attack. Or we could use mouse. And so mouse actually has the same kind of behaviors as the button presses do. So we've got button, button press, button release. And so this is going to be active as long as we're holding down that button. I think it's a 0. Okay, so this should be a Boolean value of true or false if I'm either holding down space or clicking the left mouse button. All right, so let's program us being able to actually attack with that. So I'll handle it after the movement. Now we might want to collapse some of this movement code. So I'm going to throw a comment right here. And I'm going to collapse this just so it's a little bit less, you know, in our face. And then again, same thing here. All right, so after all of that, let's start programming the attacks. So now, I do tend to like to make some of the variables as just local variables, even though it's effectively hard coding this. So we'll have a variable here called pulse laser CD, which is going to represent the cooldown for how long, how much time in between each shot. So we'll do if, oh, I guess we don't have if primary attack. Remember, that's going to either be true or false based on whether or not we're pressing the space bar or the left mouse button. All right, so if primary attack, then we want to spawn this laser. So I'm going to treat it similar to I did the engine sparks. I'm going to create a variable to be able to like update its settings. So I'm going to create this var laser, equals instance underscore create underscore layer, x comma y comma layer, and the name of the object to create. So kind of the first thing that we'll explore in a later video is if we want these to come out of a point other than the center of the ship, we are going to have a little bit of computation to do, especially considering the player can rotate. Right now, we're just going to have it come out of the center of the ship, but we will add a weapon later where it maybe comes out the sides of the ship, just so we can kind of see a difference in how that would be handled. So we create this laser. And now we want to update some of its settings. So let's set the direction and speed of the laser. So we would say laser.speed. Now, there's some, I guess, debate on whether or not we want to have the player's movement influence the speed of the laser. So I will caution you, if your speed is less than the player's maximum speed for this laser, it will look really weird. So like if the laser only travels at speed 10, but you can go up to speed 12, it's not going to look very good. So you want to try to have the speed greater than the player's movement speed. Laser.direction equals direction, and laser.image angle equals direction. So the idea is that when we spawn this laser, it's going to face in the direction the player is facing. So right now, we have not implemented a cooldown. So when I hit attack, it's going to spawn an infinitely fast number of lasers. And so let's see that in action. Oops. So, oh, my mouse, it's got some interesting issues there. So let's go fix that. I don't know why I have to invert that. All right, so, but what you can see with this is whenever I'm holding down the attack, it's going to spawn infinitely fast lasers, and that's not necessarily something that we want with this. Okay. So let's go implement a cooldown. And I did a quick Google search here, and this is actually supposed to be MB_left for the left mouse button. So you might want to fix that. So you don't need the not symbol in front of here. I believe it was Unity, I think, that uses 0. So, all right. So we fixed that, and let's implement a cooldown system. So we want another an instance variable here. So we're going to add an instance variable, and I'm going to call this cooldown_primary. And I'm not calling it cooldown because I might implement like secondary abilities or something where, you might need to have tracking multiple different cooldowns. And it's going to currently be 0. And so we're going to update this if statement to say primary attack and cooldown primary is less than or equal to 0. So the idea is that you're pressing the attack button and your weapon is ready to fire. So then let's apply the cooldown. So we will say cooldown primary. Let's do equals, because we could do plus equals, which could be interesting, but I think equals makes more sense. Pulse laser CD. And then we'll just put all of our weapon stats up here so that if we want to tweak things, we could just tweak them here. So maybe we'll even put speed here. Pulse laser speed equals 14. So that way we can minimize this when we're all done with it. And then we only have to pay attention to these variables if we want to tweak and balance things. So now this will only shoot once because we don't ever decrement the cooldown. So like I'll attack and you can see I only get one shot. So the cooldown is technically working. It's blocking us from attacking, but we do need to, inside of the end step, decrease the cooldown. As I mentioned, checking cooldowns is one of the good uses of end step. So we're going to do that right here. So we will decrease weapon cooldown. I like to use an if statement if cooldown primary is greater than 0, then cooldown primary minus equals 1. We could, if we wanted to kind of be fancy about this, we could even implement like a rate, like some kind of multiplier. So we could pick up a power up that maybe increases my cooldown recharge. We could come back to this and make this a little bit more of an interesting formula if we wanted to. For now, we won't. But I'll just like leave that thought there that you could instead tie this to an instance variable and then have some kind of power up influence the cooldown rate. And so that should get my weapon functioning in a way that we want. So when I hit play, you can kind of see that I've got, it's 6 frames in between each attack. Now we are also going to implement some kind of energy system, so the player won't be able to shoot this fast all the time. So that there's going to be, each shot has an energy cost to it, and when you run out of energy, you can't shoot until that energy recharges. So we've got a cooldown, but then also the player is going to have to manage their energy as well. And again, so this is kind of what I was talking about, where if we fly in a, so like if we shoot and we fly in a straight line, you see how our lasers stack up? And I've never really kind of came up with a good way to handle that. Like, you could add the player's speed to this, but then you end up with some very bizarre behaviors. So like you can kind of, I don't know, slingshot a projectile. So like normally the range of the projectile is like right there, but if you get some speed on it, your projectile then goes really far. So you can play around with that. Personally, like you can maybe limit this by a certain factor. I'm just going to let the lasers stack up like that and just kind of acknowledge that that's a little bit of an issue of design that I've always struggled with over the years and never came up with a solution that I like. Because you could add some kind of factor to the player speed. You can even create a more elaborate math equation to govern that. But I've never really found one I like. And I think it's just because the relative speed of the laser compared to the player's speed is so close that this is noticeable. If the projectile speed was like in the 20s, we really wouldn't notice it as much. It's just because it's so close that it's kind of problematic. So like you don't really notice it as much when, you know, it's in its 20s like this. Like, yeah, it stacks up a little bit, but it's not super noticeable. So you could try adjusting the speed, making it a little bit higher like that. Keeping in mind that it does make the weapon a little bit more powerful because it does travel that quickly. So my cat just joined me. Thank you for knocking over all my pencils, Kitty. So I think that's going to wrap this up. In the next video, we're going to add another weapon. We're going to add a shotgun-esque multi-projectile so that we can kind of see how you would switch between 2 different weapons, implement the switching, and then implement some of the energy for this. So thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.